will be introducing our next presenters. We have Dr. Kristen Higgins. She has been a counselor and educator at the University of Arkansas since 2006. She teaches in both the clinical mental health and rehabilitation concentrations. Dr. Higgins has taught ethical courses in the past and currently teaches practicum and internship courses for both CMHC and RHAB, where ethical issues are often discussed and topics of teaching. Prior to becoming faculty at U of A, Dr. Higgins worked at a local community mental health agency with experiences in both adolescent residential treatment and school-based mental health services. She is going to be assisted by Dr. Brent Williams and Dr. Erin Popejoy. I don't have the information for them, so if she wants to introduce them, I will let her do that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carrie. And thank you everybody for having us here today. Yes, so Miranda Jackson had reached out to me and asked if I might know anyone that would do an ethics presentation for the ARA conference. And I said, well, I'll do it. It would be fun. And so then I corralled Dr. Brent Williams and Dr. Erin Popejoy to join me. Brent and Erin, I'll let you all, because I want to make sure I cover what you guys want the group to know, but I'll let Brent, why don't you introduce yourself, and then Erin, we'll switch to you.
What's the line from A Princess Bride? I'm no one of consequence. I've been here at the university since 2002, was program coordinator of the rehab program until we merged, I guess, for about 13 years. Have done past work in ethics with regard to rehabilitation counseling. Here at the university, I tend to do a lot of grant-funded research and service projects, which is what I'm continuing to do now.
Thank you. Erin?
I'm Erin Popejoy. I've been with the university since August of 2015. I am the clinical coordinator as well as the clinical mental health counseling coordinator. I work a lot with the practicum and internship folks, as well as teaching the diagnosis and treatment class and usually the addictions classes as well.
Thank you. So one of the things, when asked to do an ethics presentation, it's always hard to determine, okay, what should I cover? It's great in ACA or CRC put out new ethical codes that year, because then you know exactly what you'll present on. You'll present on the new changes in the ethics code, but we haven't had those in a while. So today what I thought we would do is just more of kind of a quick review of the most important mandates of both the CRC and ACA Code of Ethics. And then if time permits, which I hope it will, we have a little group activity, which hopefully we can do here on Zoom, but to kind of talk about and get your all's input on what you think matters most. So I'm assuming we have a mix of, I kind of tried to look through, and I think the majority of the individuals here are practitioners who work in the rehab counseling field, but there may be some LPCs scattered throughout as well. But I want us to be able to have some time to get some feedback from you all as individuals who work with consumers and clients every day, to kind of get your feedback on what do you think matters most with these ethical codes? What is the one or two codes that no matter what, they're all important, but what are the most important? And I'm sorry that there's like this beam of light. I can't figure out where it's coming from, but I guess I'm just being spotlighted today. So I'll try to fix that when someone else is talking. So, but as we move forward, why do we have ethical standards? So, typically if I were teaching this in a class, I would open this up to others and we would kind of talk about, and, I think mainly sometimes people think, well, it's so that we don't get sued. And yes, of course, that's a very important part, that legal piece. But above all, it really is, Hurley, he, and Corey say our codes of ethics fulfill these three important objectives. They educate us as professionals about sound ethical conduct, how we are to behave, how we are to provide services. It also helps provide a mechanism for professional accountability. And so that's really important. because it creates kind of a standard of care that we all are to practice under. And it allows us, if we don't practice under that, or if we don't follow these ethical guidelines and mandates, then there is a course of action to hold us accountable and to have kind of standards that are in place. They also serve as a catalyst for improving practice. So whenever we're faced with an ethical dilemma or a concern comes up in our practice, and we have to turn to our ethical code, and here in a little bit, Dr. Popejoy is going to review the ethical decision-making model. If we find that maybe something we're doing isn't best practice, or if we find that something's not fitting in well with the way that we ethically have promised to practice, then that is a good starting point for helping us to figure out, okay, how can we better improve our work with consumers, our work with clients, and our practice as a whole. Most important, however, putting all of those aside, is not to necessarily protect us as providers, but it's to safeguard the welfare of our clients and consumers by providing what is in their best interest. And so, yes, when we practice ethically, when we practice by our ethical mandates, we're not only making sure that we're professional, but ultimately the reasons why we have ethical codes, the reason why we have these standards is to protect those that we work with and to make sure that we are providing them the best service, the best care in an ethically sound manner. So something that I'm sure you guys can all remember back to when you were first learning about ethics is, oftentimes ethics and legal aspects get intertwined. So just as a reminder, ethics are our standards that govern the conduct of its professional members. And so those may not necessarily be laws or be legally bound, but they are based on our ethical standards for our practice. So today, there are many of us who fall under the CRC Code of Ethics, and then there are many of us that fall under the ACA Code of Ethics, or there are some of us that fall under both of those. So, and we know when we follow two different ethical codes, just as a reminder, if there is a conflict between the two ethical codes, we know that we abide by whichever one is more strict in terms of the ethical mandate that code provides. So law, on the other hand, is a body of rules that govern the affairs of people within a community, state, or country. And so laws are, of course, dictated by legislation, whether it's state or federal. So what happens when these conflict? And this is something that always, this would create an ethical dilemma where we would turn to our ethical code, turn to our decision-making model. But ultimately, you'll hear providers or ethical textbooks say, well, the law ultimately will supersede ethics. However, in Arkansas, and I'm not sure, Brent, maybe help me out, RC piece of this, but in Arkansas, any of the rules and regulations that govern the LPC license, they are also adopted by the state legislature and our laws. And so really in Arkansas, to abide by your ethical code is to also abide by the legal obligation for your profession.
Yeah, when CORE and KCREP merged, they contacted the Commission on Rehabilitation Certification, and the Commission on Rehabilitation Certification made sure that they were dovetailing in with that. So yeah, if you're adhering to those, they are all codified in Arkansas law.
Okay, perfect. So that way it provides a little bit less of a dilemma for you because your ethics are the legal law and code. Okay, I'm going to let Dr. Williams talk about some key terms and principles related to ethical guidelines.
Yeah, there's a very famous Noam Chomsky quote that says it's not just semantics, it's always semantics. And that's just a very erudite way of saying words matter. And so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about some of the key terms. And it does really help to kind of have a foundational understanding of what we're talking about here. The first is prescriptive or mandatory ethics. And what we're talking about there are the basic level constructs of functions, the ethical functions that are often associated with compliance. And as Dr. Higgins just pointed out, compliance is often associated with basically two main things: doing no harm and basic set of activities. So these aren't the ethical principles that motivate you to attain best and facilitate your clients to their own self-actualization. These are often prescriptive or mandatory ethics, are the ethics that set the baseline of behavior, and compliance with that establishes the bare minimum of doing no harm. Now, if that's on a spectrum, then on the other side of that is we have aspirational ethics. And aspirational ethics are those ethics which are the ethical guidelines which motivate us, provide a pathway, provide guidance for helping us to facilitate clients and consumers to their self-actualization, toward empowerment, and toward having their largest place in the community. So you're looking at along this continuum, compliance and obligatory standards, ethical practices, and aspirational ones, which on the other end, which is more working to a larger betterment beyond mere compliance or base activities. If you want to go to the next slide, Dr. Higgins, please. This trickles down, and you can kind of envision this in a stair-step way. Values are core beliefs that guide everyday life. And as an example of this, we could say as counselors that we all believe that all human beings have inherent worth and dignity, that regardless of ethnicity or identity or gender, anything that could be used to differentiate people, we're saying regardless of human differentiation, everybody has inherent worth and dignity. Okay, if that's your value, then you're going to set up ethical principles, the ethics, which adhere to these values and facilitate these values. Okay, if I think regardless of human differentiation, all humans have an inherent worth and dignity, then I'm going to make sure they're treated with respect. I'm going to make sure that they're treated with equity and parity, and that they are facilitated in a way that each individual can see their own self-directedness. So I think all human beings have inherent worth and dignity. I've set up ethical principles that try to guide me and ensure that. And then you get down to morality. And morality is often seen as from a broader construct. It's also often conceptualized as being a consensual or a consensus-based thing, either from a society or a culture. And it's where we look at behavior and conduct and say, okay, we have these values. We've set up these principles that try to promote these values. Is the behavior and conduct that we're seeing, it's a process by evaluating to see if behavior and conduct adheres and meets the ethical principles we've established and the values that we say we hold. That's essentially what morality is. Dr. Higgins, if you want to go on to the next one. And within this, there's also two different kind of understandings of ethics within what's called principle ethics. And principle ethics, it can be conceptualized as a functional process. It's the way you've got a set of values, you've established a set of ethical principles, and it's how you look at ethical dilemmas, and it's also how you anticipate ethical dilemmas in the future. An example of this be like this, that more and more counselors are seeing consumers and clients who identify as non-binary. And that may be very new to a lot of counselors. And so are you, in the way from the paperwork that folks fill out to the processes that are involved, are we making sure that the processes and the way we evaluate the processes and the way we anticipate things is going to ensure that folks are treated with respect, their dignity is maintained, and that we can say we've facilitated them to be the best they can be? Whereas virtue ethics is less of a functional process than it is to do about the traits and characteristics of the counselor. We've talked about before that if you want to see, once again, principle ethics could often be referred to, certainly it is to do good, but it is safeguards. It is once again an obligatory function that prevents harm and establishes minimum standards. which is virtue ethics has more to do about the characteristics of a counselor. What are those characteristics? What are those traits in counselors that really promote and facilitate them doing the very best for their clients and consumers, so that their clients and consumers can actualize themselves and take the place in the community that they want to take. Dr. Higgins, if you'll go next. And so if we think
Do we have
about—
a question?
Sure.
I wasn't sure if I heard someone ask a question. No? Okay, sorry, Brent.
That's what. And so if we've got those key terms down, then there's just a few principles that are kind of the elemental factors that allow us to take on those different activities. Things that we fundamentally have to have in order to have ethical principles, in order to have morality, and in order to set up these frameworks. These are the key principles that are absolutely necessary for any of those to exist. And the first one is of course, autonomy. And that is, do we facilitate, honor, and respect the self-directedness of clients? If the self-determination of clients is not an inherent and integral part of what's going on, then there'll be no ethical practice. Now, the next two here seem to be kind of from what, the Journal of Duh, is non-maleficence, which is to do no harm. You're not going to enter into an activity or in any way conduct yourself in a way that harms the consumer or client. Beneficence is just the opposite of that. Your activities, your conduct, what you do is there to promote the health and well-being of the clients you serve. Now, besides those, we get into the ideas, and these have more to do with more specific behaviors. Justice is to make sure that clients are treated equally as to each other. And I'll even go a little further, that I think this gets more complicated the more we understand, like I said, some of the differentiating factors I talked about a little earlier, that this also involves parity and equity. Are we facilitating the growth and wellness in a client that recognizes their unique individuality and their individual dignity? That's essentially what justice is. Fidelity, and this often is sometimes misconstrued with veracity, and let me differentiate these, is if you make a promise and you make a commitment, do you keep it? Are you a person of your word? If you say you're going to call someone back, if you say you're going to return the email, if you say I will follow up on this resource for you, fidelity is, do you honor commitments? Do you honor your word? Veracity is more essentially just the construct of, are you honest? When you say something, is it truthful? You can go ahead and go to the next one, Dr. Higgins. The discernment of prudence, which is a very, like I say, fancy way of saying, are you exercising caution? Do the behaviors and conduct that you engage in put your clients in any risk? And you cannot be ethical. And this does not mean that you're not challenging clients. It doesn't mean that you're not asking them to explore. The notion of jeopardy is different from that of discomfort. In this, when we say the discernment improvements, you are not engaging in activities or behaviors that put clients in jeopardy. The next one is respectfulness. Yeah, if we're at this point in time and you're not clear on that one, we may have some remedial work to do. Once again, this goes back to the notion that clients have inherent worth and dignity, and part of respectfulness is not to, I don't see something, that maybe that's the tricky part of this one, is like, well, I just don't see that difference. I don't acknowledge that difference. All my clients are the same to me. Well, that's not respectful. Respectfulness is understanding the differentiation that your clients have one to another, honoring that uniqueness, and doing the very best you can to facilitate their growth within their own unique personhood. The next one is integrity. And integrity is also one that's often kind of trips folks up sometimes. it's not veracity, it's not honesty. What integrity is stability, it's coherence, it's consistency. And it's not necessarily, you know, people often refer to that as like something to do with banal boringness, or it doesn't mean that there's not novelty. What integrity means is there's enough stability and predictability within your behavior and conduct that the client does not feel threatened, that the client feels that you can be trusted. This is where a large part of trust comes from. Self-awareness, well, self-awareness of the client on the part of the counselor, understanding your role, understanding the role you play, understanding the role consumers and clients play, and being aware of the conduct and behavior and the impact it has on consumers and clients. Acknowledgement of the role of emotions. This is also very important, and it's often surprising to me how many practicing counselors are a little uneasy on this one, which is it's that emotions inform reason and they don't cloud it. And so that oftentimes, you know, if you've been trained in art in any sort of rational emotive therapy, rational behavioral therapy, that it's very easy to undertake a very prescriptive understanding of counseling and working toward a reasoned goal. And it's always good to be mindful of the ethics of making sure that emotional content informs reason. It informs the decision process. It informs the path we take. That's a very important ethical principle. And the last one here is connected with this community. And I know I've said this before, but this is about the differentiations between all, recognizing that we come from different backgrounds and have different orientations, and to understand your knowledge, your lack of knowledge, and appreciating the fact that as counselors, unless we understand the difference of community between us and our consumers and our clients, we're not engaging in ethical practice.
Okay, so I'm going to take over now that we've gone through all of the principles, both, the principle ethics and the virtue ethics. We're going to go over the general steps for ethical decision making. So the first step, obviously, is to identify what exactly is the problem. Is this truly an ethical issue? Is it something else? Is it a clinical issue? Is it a legal issue? If it is a legal issue, you may need to seek legal advice and legal consult rather than ethical decision making. And so that's something we always need to parse out. What exactly is going on? Let's outline the facts. And see, who is this related to also? You know, is this related directly to you? Is this related to a colleague? Is this a greater institutional issue? At which point, if it is an institutional issue, maybe there are policy and procedures in place that can be looked at to determine what is the best course of action. So really, again, parsing out what exactly is the problem, who does it have to do with? Once you've figured that out, moving on to examining the relevant codes of ethics and the professional literature. What do they say? And so whether that's the ACA Code of Ethics, the CRC Code of Ethics, really looking through those and seeing what is said about this issue. If there is a very clear-cut ethical guideline that is relevant to what's going on, that gives you a very concrete answer about what needs to happen, that could potentially be the end of what you're doing. However, oftentimes most of our ethical issues are a lot more complex than that. And we need to move further into this. If that is the case, then we need to consider, what are the moral principles? What do our ethics say? Which ethics apply? And how do they apply? And are any of them potentially in conflict with each other? So really looking through and figuring out what actually makes sense here. What can I apply to this situation? what ethics might be in breach here, what is being followed, and really listing that out. Next is consulting. I think we're all always told to consult all the time. We never want to be practicing in isolation. That actually is something that puts us at a really high risk for making unethical decisions or getting us into ethical situations. So always consulting, whether that's colleagues, supervisors, other experts, making sure that you are consulting with people. I was always told when you encounter an ethical issue, try to consult with at least 3 different people, and look at what's being said within those consultations, and looking at how the ethical guidelines might apply to those conversations as well. The 5th step is basically what screams that these were created by counselors. Attend to your emotions. As Dr. Williams was just talking about, we really need to pay attention to this piece. Attending to your emotions is extremely important. We know that emotions inform what we do. Emotions give us information, but we also know that emotions can sometimes cloud our judgment depending on what's going on. And so we need to attend to our emotions. We need to be sure that we are being objective about the situation while still taking context and other pieces into consideration.
Erin, do you care if I pop in real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
So, it's interesting when Kitchener and some of the first early theorists set up ethical decision-making models, this emotional, attending to your emotions was not a step or acknowledged in them. And then as some more theorists that kind of came from a feminist perspective, they started looking at, we've got all these facts, we've got all these pieces that we're looking at, but we also need to really pay attention to our own emotional state, reaction, our clients, and how we feel about the matter. And I think a lot of us do that anyway, but it was nice to see kind of this new addition of this. And I would say that's only been in the past 20, 25 years or so that I guess that's not that soon now that I think about it. But I know when I learned about ethical codes in my master's program, the emotional piece wasn't in there. So
yeah, no, I think that's a great point that again, emotions give us information, and it's important. We teach our clients that emotions are important and that they convey information, and we need to take that into consideration as well. And I think that this goes hand in hand to some extent with the 6th step, which is, if needed, involve the client in the decision-making process. So for example, if you run into a situation where you have a client who is expressing something like suicidal intent, where we know that ethically we have to either make a report or get them to some type of safety, or create some type of safety plan with them, we need to look at, okay, how am I feeling about this? What's happening internally with me? And what emotions are coming up for me in this process, while also involving the client. I know best practices, and something that I tend to do is when I have situations arise like this, whether it's around suicidality or having to hotline a situation, I always involve the client, and I really try to give them the autonomy to be able to take control of the situation themselves. If they are willing to make a hotline call themselves with me, then that is something that involves them and gives them as much control and empowerment within the situation as possible, while still keeping with our ethical decision-making guidelines, and keeps our relationship intact. We all know that sometimes when those situations specifically come up, it can cause a rupture in the therapeutic relationship. And so being able to involve our clients in the decision-making process can be really important, and actually strengthen our therapeutic relationship as well. So then 7th, we want to identify what are our desired outcomes, and what are the potential courses of action. So what are the implications for the people involved. And this really combines both 7 and 8, honestly. So considering consequences of those options and determining a course of action, just what are the implications for the people involved? Let's look at all of our options and eliminate any options that don't give us the desired results or that may cause more problematic issues. So making sure that we are really just laying out what are our options and how do we get where we want to be. And then evaluating the selected course of action. So once we do choose something and say, this is the route that we want to go, this is what's going to happen, how effective is this going to be in, again, getting us to our desired outcomes, creating the least amount of additional problematic issues, if that's a concern, and making sure that we get to our desired results. And then finally, doing it, implementing that course of action, putting that into motion, and going through whatever steps need to be taken to address and hopefully resolve the ethical issue. Okay. So this is Kitchener's model, and Kitchener in 1984 created this model, a lot of the principles that we've talked about, and talks about these 2 levels of judgment. And so we have the critical evaluative level, which is kind of what we just walked through. A lot of the step-by-step objective judgments and evaluation of the situation. So really looking at what are the ethical rules, what are the principles, what are those theories, and paying attention to those. But then she also talks about the intuitive level. So what are our immediate judgments and actions? What are just the facts that we know right off the top? And then what's our ordinary moral sense, just being human, and knowing what our basic sort of right and wrong, along with the gray area that can come in between. Where do things land? What feels right to us? Being able to work that into that critical evaluative piece. And that's part of, I think, where, again, that emotional piece comes into play as well, is, as Dr. Williams mentioned, a lot of that critical evaluative piece, it's important and it guides us, but it is also a lot of safeguards, things that protect us, things that also protect our clients and consumers, but are the very straightforward kind of sterile pieces. And when we bring in that intuitive level, it's, what is my gut telling me? What feels right? Just as a decent human being, what might be the right way to go on this within those greater safeguards. Okay. Next slide, Kristen. Okay. So finally, looking at some ethical theory, when we are considering making our different decisions, when we're looking at various situations, we want to consider universality, which really just means that whatever behavior we choose, whatever decision we might choose, is ethical only if it can be applied to all similar cases. One thing that always makes me think about this is I heard a story of a counselor who was working in a rural area, small town, and was working with a teenage girl. In the middle of the night, got an emergency call. This teenage girl had been kicked out of her home. It was the middle of winter. She had nowhere to go. And that counselor decided in the moment that she was going to take in this girl and let her stay with her. Which I think all of us who have that helper heart is like, yep, we get that. We understand that pull to help somebody. But also thinking, okay, if this was a maybe larger, more urban area, would that be considered to be the same situation? So really looking at knowing that even though the helper in us wants to do that, we understand the empathy, we understand the compassion that's happening in that moment, knowing that that was probably not the ethical decision in that particular circumstance, because it can't be applied to all similar cases. You know, when we look at other cases where there are probably places that she could have reached out to take this client, and knowing that those places do exist, that really can't be applied on top of everything else, that it doesn't unambiguously apply to other similar cases. So knowing that universality is really important when we start to consider things, especially when we start to talk about sort of case-by-case situations, or when we're looking at very specific contexts, we have to kind of zoom out a little bit and consider, what does this universality look like? And second, the balancing principle, which is that when we have ethical principles that might be in conflict, which does sometimes happen, an ethical decision is one that produces the least amount of avoidable harm to the individuals involved. So if we can potentially avoid some of the harm that may come about, we go with whatever decision gets us to that point, knowing that sometimes our ethical principles might be in conflict. It could possibly be that, you know, respecting somebody's autonomy, we know that they're going to get themselves into a dangerous situation, or we know that they intend to harm somebody else or themselves. And at that point, we have to intervene. So always making sure that we are considering those pieces as well.
Okay, thank you. So typically at this point in any ethics presentation, the presenters give you vignettes. They split you up into small groups, and you look at the vignettes and you go through an ethical decision-making model. Because this is a large group and we're on Zoom, I'm going to flip this just a little, and instead of putting everybody in small rooms and talking and then coming back, because I don't think we'll have time to discuss, I'm going to kind of go over these 6 different ethical mandates or ethical standards that we have in our codes. And then I'm hoping we can open it up to some discussion just as a large group and kind of get some feedback from you all on what do you think matters most. I mean, of course, anytime we're faced with an ethical dilemma, we're going to look at, you know, we're going to look at our different codes, we're going to look at the principles, but just in kind of going over some of the things that, you know, are our basic understanding of ethical principles. So we have confidentiality. So we always want to protect the confidential material, the things that are shared, the records, the privacy of our clients. And so that may be something that we feel that's the most important no matter what. But then look, we go down to the duty to warn and protect. Our duty to warn or our duty to protect basically implies that we are going to break our clients' or consumers' confidentiality. So you can see right there that those 2 ethical mandates conflict with one another in some situations. Do no harm could also come into play here as well. If we, you know, step in and work, do one of our duty to warn situations or duty to protect, and we have to actually help assist a client or consumer get into a more restrictive setting or hospital setting. But we also know that those settings are not always as beneficial to this specific client or consumer. We have to kind of balance that out of protection versus that harm. And then on the other side, we have issues of competence. And we haven't really talked much about this, but this is more on the level of the counselor themselves. How competent are they in terms of treating the specific issue or situation that their client presents with? How competent are they in their training and knowledge to work in a specific setting where they're practicing counseling? How, you know, today everyone is here because our our boards and our credentialing agencies require us to continue with CEUs, which speaks directly to this idea of we need to continue to have training and continuing education to be competent in the areas we treat. The other principle we've talked about is autonomy. So this is autonomy to empower our clients to make decisions themselves, to take courses of action that they choose. We are not here to give them advice or to tell them what to do. We are here to help support them on their journey, provide resources, provide information when needed, but ultimately their decisions are their decisions. And so you can also see where this idea of respecting autonomy of our clients could interact with the duty to warn or protect, or the do no harm aspects. And then there are those legal issues that come about. Now, again, in Arkansas, the legal and ethics are one and the same, but this might be considerations of, if a client shares with us something that falls within a legal mandate, and it doesn't necessarily fall within that duty to warn or protect, but it is a gray area of, this could legally be a situation where my client needs to take responsibility for something that has occurred, but then we're also breaking confidentiality. So you can see how all 6 of these are all very, very important matters to address and apply, and principles to practice, but oftentimes they can be competitive with one another. So again, I was going to have you guys in a previous presentation where I had done something similar. We actually had 2 hours, so we were able to break up in small groups, and we had some vignettes to look at and kind of talk about what matters most. But in sake of time, and I also want to leave time for any questions or comments. So does anybody have, as you kind of see these and first read these, does anybody have an automatic response where they're like, oh, that is definitely most important. We should always attune to that ethical mandate no matter what? Any thoughts or comments on this? And I can't see everybody, so I guess if you want to make a comment, you can just unmute and start talking.
I'm looking at the chat here, Kristen, and somebody said autonomy is probably one of the most important.
Okay, so would you like to expand on that? What about autonomy?
I think that, like you said, there are a lot of gray areas when it comes to confidentiality, doing no harm, duty to warn and protect, and even sometimes competence. But with autonomy, you are still allowing the client to make decisions for themselves. So that would be, for me, one of the most important things, not only as a VR counselor, but also as a therapist, to provide the client with the space to be who they are and make decisions.
Can I say something? I was going to go with autonomy too, because I am a rehabilitation student that is going through ARS. And it wasn't until I had people believe that I could do what I wanted to do that I've been able to actually succeed for the first time. So definitely autonomy.
Good. And great arguments for why that is so important. And I think, yes, when we want to empower our clients and consumers, again, it's about what they want, what they recognize are their needs, and also to support that these choices, their path is theirs to choose. And it is, it's not for us to tell clients and consumers what they can and can't do. So I think there's great arguments for that autonomy piece.
I'll even add a little something to this, is that a lot of times we conceptualize autonomy as we're not doing anything to hurt that or hinder that. It's like, okay, I'm going to empower my client to be self-directed and autonomous. But we all know, especially if within rehabilitation counseling, that autonomy isn't not getting in the way of, since the environment, the culture we live in puts up purposeful, intentional, detrimental barriers to autonomy, that autonomy isn't just getting out of someone's way. That's one of the more places where you have to be the most purposeful, the most intentional, and the most the most direct in how you approach it. So it is that conceptualization that it's not doing something. Autonomy is not doing harm. Autonomy really is a very active engagement if that particular ethical principle is going to be realized.
This is Judy Smith. I have a question to follow what Dr. Williams said. So can one of you professionals give us an example of a counselor leading versus facilitating the decision making?
So leading in terms of like the advising or telling what to do versus, I think of that is, let's just do, I'll just use kind of a very common, maybe VR goal. A client comes in looking for employment, wanting to, be a member of the world of work, and we start working with them. And there's two different routes we could do. We could kind of maybe look at some assessments or look at some of the things they've shared interest. And then all of a sudden I could be like, okay, you fall in this category. Here's some options for you. Which of these options do you like? So very specific, very leading in a way of here are your only options. Whereas a facilitating or processing that with our client would be taking that time to, okay, well, what interests you? What would you like to do? What are some things that you've thought about in the past of things that you want to do? And even if they share, well, I really want to do this, but I don't think I could, rather than us saying, okay, well, let's come and look at these. Let's talk about, okay, well, what would make it where you could? What are some resources? What are some training? What are some opportunities that I can help you find to help facilitate your meeting that goal versus us giving a very prescriptive, here are your options, now pick from these, or even more smaller, not even giving options. What is it, Dr. Williams and you and Dr. Cook always say in the fields of the 5 F's, food, filth, folding, I can't remember what the other two are, but not always just limiting what we give as our vocational options to our client, but really facilitating what they want to do and what are their goals. Does that help?
Yes, very, very much. In fact, for me, if a kid lives in a 200-town population in Chittister, Arkansas, and they say they want to be an astronaut, and they're in high school, and I look at their math is first grade, reading is second grade, I might ask, why do you want to be an astronaut? And typically they'll say a uniform.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then they get excited when you say, yeah, I want to wear a uniform. And you start thinking, well, what are some other things where people wear a uniform that are in this community? Because you say you don't want to leave here. Does that sound something that's even more appropriate maybe, or as appropriate or appropriate?
Yeah, and and I love the idea of, rather than just saying, well, I'm sorry, you don't have the scores or the knowledge or the education to be an astronaut, but instead you took the time to really listen and find out, okay, well, what about an astronaut excites you? What about, and then all of a sudden, yeah, it's not necessarily the astronaut itself, it's the uniform. So yeah, let's look at other occupations and other jobs out there where you can wear a uniform. So that's a perfect example. Was it Judy that gave that example?
Yes.
Okay, that perfect example of us not just and that also is that autonomy piece too, because we're not just shutting down our clients or consumers with, well, I'm sorry, this isn't possible. We're looking at, okay, how could we even make that possible, or what else could fit those interests? So that's a perfect example. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want you to know that I came up with that because a counselor, I had a speaker who was the first Black Top Gun pilot come to speak to a school in Camden. And there was a student there, and the counselor said in front of the pilot, you'll never be anything but a ditch digger.
Mm.
And interestingly, the pilot said to the student, I was so upset and concerned because I didn't know how the pilot might react. He said, well, I've got my private plane out here. Why don't I take you for a ride? And that
Oh,
young man is doing
wow.
very well, very well, very well.
And you know, think about it, especially when working with students or individuals with disabilities. Think about how many times the environment or people in their environment have told them they can't or they never will. And we need to, I mean, this is our basic values and principles. We need to change that message to you can, and let's figure out how.
I was going to say the issue, I think what comes into here, and it's very important, is what's known as the dignity of risk. If you and I go out to dinner and you're about to cut your steak up and I yank the knife out of your hand and I go, you know, you're just not competent enough to do this. Let me do this for you. You're not going to be very happy with me. And I think one of the things that as counselors that we have to be careful, and especially with the field of disability, is assuming risk is how we grant people dignity. You don't you rip the knife out of someone's hand and say, you can't cut your steak. You don't say, no, let me carry you across the street. You can't make it across by yourself. That part of autonomy is the function of the dignity of risk and allowing you prepare people, you provide people with resources, you help them in the decision-making process. But the dignity of risk and the assumption of risk is an inherent part of autonomy.
And I want to, because I see here in the chat, and you know, I think those of you that kind of look at this, there is sort of a trick within this, what matters most, and some of you have already kind of picked up on that, and that do no harm really does encompass all of these things, and it helps us to, and sometimes the harm, we have to look at that balancing principle of what's going to be more harmful to my consumer or my client, what's going to be more harmful maybe to individuals in my client or consumer's environment. I mean, if a client has made a pretty specific threat against somebody that's identified that they're planning to leave our office and go and hurt or kill this person, then, you know, that balancing principle of looking at that harm piece. And so I think that's a great piece that really we could argue, and kind of that's our loophole here, is saying, well, what matters most is that do no harm because it protects these other things. So so thank you for those who, you know, kind of pointed that out here in the chat here. So we have about 6 minutes and open to, oh, Carla, it looks like you have a question.
Well, I actually have a comment when we were talking about that. I really believe that all of them build on one another.
Yes.
I think you really have to establish, we have to start somewhere, and then you just go out from there. You branch out. You know, if you start with confidentiality, then you get the other ones to, such as the no harm, do no harm, how it relates to confidentiality. So, you know, just building on them, and then they all come together.
I have to think that competence comes into play more than the doing no harm and stuff, because if the counselor isn't talking to the person, and I've had this happen to me, like they're a person and they're already in a mind frame and they need maybe a medication adjustment, but you know how hard it is to get in to see psychiatrists in rural areas already. So like, if the counselor's not competent enough to be able to meet that client where they're at, then the autonomy and the no harm doesn't matter, because when that client leaves that counselor, the client's going to do whatever he wants to, whatever she wants to. Like, the tools that the counselor gives the client, the competence in that area is what I would see as the most important if it wasn't autonomy. After the way he explained it, I would have to say that. That was just my little piece because you asked.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And again, I think that's what's so you know, they are all so intertwined. And we could also say, well, not providing those skills, tools, or resources, or on the other end, not having a competent counselor, ultimately those cause harm as well. And so I think it's sort of like the chicken or the egg, which one comes first, which one is more important. But the important thing is we attune to all of them and we look at what's most important in that situation. And this is a great example because everybody does have kind of a different area where they would focus. And that's why ethics are never black and white, never very clear. You know, I'm sure you all can remember in your ethics class, you ask questions and your professor will say, well, it depends, or I don't know. And so that's one of the most frustrating things to hear, but it really does. There's a few things that we can say, yes, no matter what, you have to do this. But other than that, it's very gray. That's why it's important that we have these conversations, and probably why, you know, our licensing board say, hey, you always have to have some ethics training because we've got to stay up on these issues. So. Well, I do appreciate, go ahead.
Communication, like sometimes the client doesn't know, like they're like talking loud and stuff too. So like, I know that if I had a client talking to me loud and yelling, like I'd be like, oh, that's just his voice. But like, if communication gets off, then that can throw the whole thing off too, because then the client's not listening to the. So it's like intersectional from every way. Like that, I was just agreeing with you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and you know, sectional with how the client presents, with diversity variables, culture variables. I mean, there's so many things going on that it's really hard to be very prescriptive about. This is what you do in this case. So,
and that's what's crazy about ethics. It's fascinating though, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah, it's a fun topic. So, and I know we're at our time, and I really appreciate you all letting us have the chance to come and present today. And it's good to see, I didn't get to see all the faces, but I know there are former students out there, and miss you guys. Good to see you out here as professionals. So that's exciting. So, so thank you.
Thank you guys for being here. You guys did amazing with taking ethics and making it not dull. How many times have we been in ethics and we're sitting there going, oh, is this ever going to end? You guys did phenomenal. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you everyone for participating in the conference. I just want to do a few housekeeping things as we end for the day. Just a friendly reminder, please contact Carrie Woodall, not Human Resources, if you're wanting to cancel your PRD. For your ARA membership, please reach out to Carrie. She will get you the forms. Also, don't forget, we are going to have a live in-person conference in October. It's October 28th and 29th. So keep an eye out because I'm going to be sending out the call for proposals as well as the invitation so you guys can make your reservations and join us. So we hope to see you guys in October. And thank you guys for having this conference be so beneficial and so great.